So here's a question that I get a lot in my memory seminars.
So what's the hardest thing to memorize?
And the answer is, well, I know what's the hardest thing for me to memorize, but the hardest thing for people to memorize in general is going to be different for everybody. Why? Let's say that somebody who has no background on engineering, and then there's somebody who is an engineer, and they're both given information about an engineering concept to memorize, and the concept is new to both of them. Well, the person who is not the engineer is going to have a hard time memorizing the data because they don't have a background knowledge of engineering. So if you have a background knowledge of something, it's going to be easier for you to memorize. What's one of the hardest things for me personally to memorize? Music. I'd like to learn how to play the guitar, but I don't really have an idea and a background in music, or I don't really understand a lot about it. So because of that, it's harder for me to memorize than, let's say, a string of numbers, because I've trained to memorize a string of numbers. Answer number one, it's going to be different for everybody. Point number two, what you have systematized will be easier for you to memorize, and what you have not systematized will be harder for you to memorize. What I mean by it is this. Whenever I wanted to set the record for the fastest to memorize a deck of cards, I first created a system to do it, a structure, a mental structure in a database on how to memorize a deck of cards. And by creating this structure, it became easy for me. I systematized it. I just used the example of I want to learn how to play the guitar, but it's hard for me to learn how to memorize to do that. How would it be easier for me? If I looked at it and I got a little bit of background information on how to play the guitar, and I read about it a little bit and kind of got a baseline knowledge, and then I systematized how to do it. Maybe I systematized how to memorize certain chords or certain hand positions. If you systematize something, it's going to help you be able to memorize it easier. My favorite way to systematize something is to write out all the key points that make up that concept and kind of maybe group them. And then after I have them grouped, I will put them in my mind palace, which is a way to memorize stuff. If you don't know what a mind palace is, I'll put a link down below in the description. And the third thing I will say is if you are able to see what you want to memorize in pictures, it's going to be easier for you. If you are not able to think in pictures about that concept, it's going to be harder for you. What are easy things for me to memorize? A string of numbers, a deck of cards, people's names and faces. Now, why is it so easy for me to remember people's names and faces, but it's harder for some other people? It's because I have pictures for names. I've created images for names. Steve is a stove. Lisa's the Mona Lisa. Brian is a brain. Because I've systematized it and created pictures for the names, it's easy for me to remember. Why is it easy for me to memorize a deck of cards? Because I've created pictures for the cards. There is a condition known as synesthesia. Synesthesia is a brain condition where you are automatically seeing things as pictures. In other words, when somebody sees a string of numbers, they are smelling something. They have smells associated with numbers, or they have colors associated with numbers. Now, this is not something that they are doing consciously. It is an unconscious condition. I was at the World Memory Championships in 2009, and the guy beside me, he asked me, "What's the system you're using to memorize a string of numbers?" And I said, "I'm using the major system," which is a way to memorize numbers by turning them into a picture. If you don't know what the major system is, I'll put a link down below in the description about the major system. But I replied to him, "I'm using the major system to turn pictures into numbers." And then I said, "What system are you using?" He said, "Well, I smell numbers. Every number for me smells like a different food, and it's just natural. It's not something that I came up with. It's natural." He had synesthesia. That word, whatever it is, synesthesia. He had that condition. After it was over, he said, "How did you do?" I said, "I think I did pretty well." I said, "How did you do?" He said, "Man, I did terrible." He said, "I'm so hungry, and when I was trying to memorize those numbers, they smelled so tasty, and I couldn't focus." I'm like, man, I didn't know what to say. It was a funny thing. But this synesthesia, where you are turning numbers into colors or smells, or people's names into colors or smells, It's a unique condition, but people who have it are able to remember numbers or names or whatever because they're involving their other senses. So what can you do to make things easier to memorize? Create a system and start seeing it in pictures. Now let me give you what was one of the hardest things for me to personally memorize. I memorized everybody who died in the war in Afghanistan. There's 2,400 of them, and I memorized them in the order of their death. And I wrote them out on a wall. It's 7,000 words. It takes 10 hours, 10, 11 hours for me to write out, and it took 10 months for me to memorize. People will stand at that wall, and they will look at it, and they will say, man, this is such a display of magnificent memory. And I say, well, this is a little bit memory. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But this is more discipline. You see, everybody, once they learn the memory system that I know, has the ability to memorize 7,000 words in sequence. But most people don't do it. Either number one, they don't have the reason, they don't have the desire. But let's say they had the reason and they had the desire. What they're still going to have is the discipline to do it. What is the hardest thing to memorize? The hardest thing to memorize is something you don't have the discipline to put in the time to do. Memorizing stuff is actually pretty easy once you learn a system on how to do it. But having the discipline to sit down and do it is much harder than actually memorizing the data. And that is the truth. So in review, what is the hardest thing to memorize? It's different for every person. If you have a background knowledge on something, it's going to be easier to memorize. If you have a system, if you've systematized it by using the mind palace and grouping it into different categories and then putting it in the mind palace, it's going to be easier for you. If you are seeing it as pictures, it's going to be easier for you. Maybe you have synesthesia and you are seeing pictures naturally, or maybe you don't, like most people. I don't have it. This means you're going to have to create pictures for numbers. You're going to have to create pictures for names. You're going to have to create pictures for a deck of cards. You're going to have to create pictures for the poem you want to memorize. But if you have pictures for it, it will be easier. And then my last point on this, the hardest thing to memorize is whatever you don't have the discipline to sit down and just do it. If you like this video and if you'd like my answer, give me a thumbs up. But I'll ask you this question. What questions do you have for me about memory? What do you want to know? Ask them down below in the comments and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. I might not be able to get to all of them, but I will as many as I can. And if you want to see my videos where I answer the questions that are coming up, click this little subscribe button and get the bell alert, and you'll get the bell alert as I answer these questions. But guys, I appreciate all the likes. Oh, final thing. Down below in the description, I have a link to my Mind Palace video. If you don't know what that is, I'll have a link to my How to Create Pictures for Numbers video. That's down below. Also down below, I'll have a link to my Black Belt Memory course. Click that link, get the free gift, and get the course. You're going to love it. I'll see you on the next video.